Picture this. It's 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered Europe, has just suffered his most humiliating defeat. But it wasn't at the hands of another European empire. It wasn't even on European soil. This crushing blow came from an island in the Caribbean, from people who, just 13 years earlier, had been enslaved, brutalized, and considered nothing more than property. This is the story of Haiti. The story of the only successful slave revolution in human history. For centuries, historians buried this tale. Colonial powers erased it from textbooks. Why? Because it shattered their most fundamental belief, that enslaved people were incapable of freedom, incapable of self-governance, incapable of defeating the world's mightiest armies. But on January 1st, 1804, formerly enslaved Africans did the impossible. They declared independence. They created a nation. They abolished slavery forever. And they did it all while fighting simultaneously against France, Britain, and Spain, the three most powerful colonial empires of their time. How did this happen? How did 500,000 enslaved people, armed with little more than machetes and an unbreakable will to be free, defeat professional armies equipped with the finest weapons Europe could provide? The answer lies in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, a place so profitable it was called the Pearl of the Antilles. This small Caribbean island generated more wealth than all 13 American colonies combined. Its sugar plantations fed European tables. Its coffee filled European cups. Its profits built European cities. But this wealth came at an unimaginable cost: the blood, sweat, and lives of hundreds of thousands of African souls, torn from their homeland and forced into a living hell that would make even the strongest person weep. Yet from this darkness came light. From this oppression came liberation. From this hell came heroes whose names should echo through history: Toussaint L'Ouverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe, leaders who transformed from enslaved laborers into brilliant military strategists, skilled diplomats, and founding fathers of the world's first Black Republic. This isn't just the story of Haiti. This is the story of what happens when human beings refuse to accept that their condition is permanent, when they dare to dream of freedom despite overwhelming odds, when they choose to fight rather than submit, to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. The stakes couldn't have been higher. If they succeeded, they would inspire enslaved people across the Americas to rise up. They would prove that Black people could govern themselves, could create civilization, could claim their place as equals in the human family. If they failed, they would face torture, execution, and the crushing of hope for generations to come. They chose to risk everything. And in doing so, they changed the world forever. The world of Saint-Domingue. To understand the magnitude of what happened in Haiti, you must first understand Saint-Domingue, a place where paradise and hell existed side by side. Located on the western third of the island of Hispaniola, Saint-Domingue occupied one of the most strategic positions in the Caribbean. Its deep harbors could shelter entire fleets. Its mountains provided natural fortresses. Its valleys contained some of the richest soil on Earth. By 1789, this French colony had become the most profitable piece of land in the world. The numbers are staggering. Saint-Domingue produced 60% of all the coffee consumed in Europe and 40% of all sugar imported by France and Britain combined. Ships loaded with these precious commodities sailed from Cap Français and Port-au-Prince to fill the warehouses of Paris, London, and Amsterdam. But who paid the true price for this wealth? The population told the story of exploitation on an almost unimaginable scale. Out of roughly 550,000 people living in Saint-Domingue, nearly 500,000 to 90% of the total population were enslaved Africans. Think about that ratio for a moment. 9 out of every 10 people you would meet were human beings held in bondage, forced to work without pay, subject to being bought and sold like livestock. These weren't just numbers in a ledger. These were mothers separated from their children, fathers torn from their families, young people who would never know freedom, elders who remembered Africa but would never see home again. Above them in the social hierarchy lived about 40,000 free people of color, the gens de couleur. Many were the mixed-race children of white planters and enslaved women, legally free but denied full rights. They owned property, some even owned enslaved people themselves. Yet they faced constant discrimination. and legal restrictions that reminded them daily of their precarious position in colonial society. At the top of this pyramid sat roughly 30,000 white colonists, plantation owners, merchants, government officials, and overseers who lived in luxury built entirely on enslaved labor for the enslaved majority. Each day began before dawn and ended long after sunset. In sugar mills that operated around the clock during harvest season, people worked 18-hour shifts in suffocating heat. The massive stone rollers that crushed sugar cane crushed human limbs with equal efficiency. Exhausted workers who stumbled too close faced amputation or death. Coffee plantations spread across mountain slopes required constant tending. Enslaved people climbed steep terraces carrying heavy loads, their bare feet bleeding on sharp rocks, their backs bent under baskets of beans destined for European breakfast tables. The punishments for resistance, or even for working too slowly, defied human decency. Whippings that left backs resembled raw meat were considered routine discipline. Branding with hot irons marked people as property. Some masters buried rebellious, enslaved people up to their necks and covered their heads with honey to attract insects. Others used attack dogs trained specifically to hunt human beings. Yet the white colonists lived as if they inhabited a different world entirely. In Cap Francais, they built mansions that rivaled those of Paris. They imported the finest wines, silks, and furnishings. They hosted elaborate balls and maintained European customs as if they weren't. Surrounded by hundreds of thousands of people, whose every breath testified to the injustice of their system, this grotesque inequality created constant tension. Free people of color demanded the same rights as whites, but were repeatedly refused. Poor whites resented wealthy planters, but feared losing their privileged position above black people. And the enslaved population, aware that they vastly outnumbered their oppressors, began to whisper dangerous questions. What if we stopped working? What if we fought back? What if we were free? Small acts of resistance happened daily. Tools mysteriously broke. Fires started in suspicious locations. Overseers disappeared during nighttime rounds. Some enslaved people ran away to mountain hideouts called maroon communities, where they lived as free people and occasionally raided plantations. But these individual acts of defiance, while courageous, couldn't challenge the fundamental system. What was needed was something unprecedented. In human history, a coordinated revolution that would not only break the chains of slavery but create an entirely new society based on freedom and equality. The ingredients for such a revolution were all present in Saint-Domingue. Brutal oppression that made life unbearable, a population imbalance that favored the enslaved, natural terrain perfect for guerrilla warfare, and most importantly, human beings who refused to accept their condition as permanent. All that was needed was a spark. Causes of the revolution. Revolution doesn't happen overnight. It builds like a storm, gathering strength from multiple sources until it becomes an unstoppable force. In Saint-Domingue, several powerful currents were converging by the late 1780s, creating conditions that would soon explode into the most significant slave rebellion in human history. The most immediate cause was the sheer brutality of plantation life, which had reached levels that shocked even hardened colonial administrators. The average life expectancy of an enslaved person on a sugar plantation was just 7 years after arrival from Africa. 7 years. This wasn't life, it was a slow, methodical death sentence disguised as labor. The mathematics of slavery had become so cruel that plantation owners found it more profitable to literally work people to death and buy replacements rather than invest in humane conditions that might keep workers alive longer. Ship after ship arrived from Africa, carrying human cargo to feed this death machine. Between 1783 and 1791 alone, nearly 300,000 Africans were imported to Saint-Domingue, not to expand the population, but simply to replace those who had died. But something else was happening during these same years that would prove equally important. Ideas were spreading. The European Enlightenment had introduced revolutionary concepts about human rights, natural law, and the equality of all people. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu wrote about liberty, justice, and the consent of the governed. These ideas, initially meant for educated Europeans, began filtering through colonial society in unexpected ways. Enslaved people working in plantation houses overheard conversations about natural rights. Free people of color, many of whom had been educated in France, returned to Saint-Domingue carrying books and pamphlets that challenged the very foundations of colonial society. Even some white colonists began questioning whether a system this brutal could be morally justified. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. How could Europeans speak eloquently about liberty and human dignity while simultaneously enslaving hundreds of thousands of people? How could they declare that all men were created equal while treating Africans as property? These philosophical inconsistencies created cracks in the ideological foundation of slavery itself. Then came 1789, and everything changed. The French Revolution erupted with its rallying cry of liberty, equality, fraternity. News of the storming of the Bastille, the declaration of the rights of man and citizen, and the overthrow of aristocratic privilege spread throughout the French Empire, including Saint-Domingue. Initially, white colonists welcomed these developments, hoping the revolution would give them greater autonomy from royal control and reduce restrictions on their profitable slave trade. Free people of color saw opportunity too. Surely a revolution based on equality would extend rights to them as well. But what about the enslaved population? Did the revolutionaries in Paris mean all people when they declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights? Or did they mean only white people? The answer remained deliberately ambiguous, creating a dangerous situation. Hope is perhaps the most powerful force in human history, and hope was spreading through the slave quarters of Saint-Domingue like wildfire. Rumors circulated that the King of France had already freed all enslaved people, but that local colonial authorities were hiding this decree. Other stories claimed that 3 days of freedom per week had been granted from Paris, but plantation owners were refusing to comply. None of these rumors were true, but their effect was real. Enslaved people began to believe that freedom might be possible, that powerful forces in France might support their liberation, that their condition was not permanent after all. Meanwhile, tensions between the different racial groups in Saint-Domingue were reaching a breaking point. Free people of color, inspired by revolutionary ideals, began demanding full political rights. They formed organizations, sent delegations to Paris, and insisted on representation in colonial assemblies. Their wealth, some owned extensive plantations and hundreds of enslaved people, gave weight to their demands. White colonists violently opposed any expansion of rights to free people of color, fearing it would undermine white supremacy and encourage enslaved people to expect similar treatment. They argued that any crack in the racial hierarchy would lead to the destruction of colonial society. They were probably right. Economic factors added another layer of instability. The colonial economy depended entirely on the exploitation of enslaved labor, but this system contained internal contradictions that made it increasingly unstable. Plantation owners needed constantly fresh supplies of enslaved workers to replace those who died. But the international slave trade was becoming more expensive and politically controversial. Revolutionary propaganda from France also played a crucial role. Pamphlets and newspapers arrived regularly from Paris, filled with inflammatory language about overthrowing oppressors and establishing justice. Though most enslaved people couldn't read, those who could often shared this information orally, and the messages spread through plantation communities. Perhaps most importantly, a generation of leaders was emerging from within the enslaved population. People who combined traditional African political and military knowledge with understanding of European tactics and politics. Some had been educated, others had traveled as servants to their masters. Still others had served in colonial militias and learned military skills. These future leaders watched the conflicts between white colonists and free people of color with keen interest. They observed that the white population was divided and distracted. They noted that France was convulsed by its own revolution and couldn't spare significant military resources for colonial conflicts. Most significantly, they realized that the massive enslaved population had natural advantages that no other slave rebellion in history had possessed: overwhelming numerical superiority, knowledge of the terrain, experience with guerrilla tactics from African military traditions, and for the first time, an international political climate that included serious discussion of human rights and abolition. By 1791, all the elements for revolution were in place. What was needed now was organization, leadership, and a spark to ignite the powder keg that Saint-Domingue had become. The uprising begins. The night of August 22, 1791, changed the course of human history. What began as coordinated uprisings on plantations across northern Saint-Domingue would become the largest and most successful slave rebellion the world had ever seen. But this wasn't a spontaneous explosion of rage. The revolution was carefully planned, meticulously organized, and launched by leaders who understood that their only chance for success lay in coordination, strategy, and absolute commitment to freedom or death. The planning had been underway for months. In secret meetings held deep in the forests, far from the eyes of overseers and masters, enslaved people from different plantations came together to discuss something that had never been attempted before on such a scale: simultaneous uprising across an entire colony. These weren't uneducated field hands stumbling blindly toward rebellion. Many of the leaders possessed sophisticated political and military knowledge. Some had been soldiers in African armies before their enslavement. Others had served in colonial militias and learned European military tactics. Still others had been educated and understood the political implications of what they were planning. The leadership included both enslaved Africans and free people of color who had decided that gradual reform was impossible. Only revolution could bring justice. They established communication networks between plantations, identified sympathetic free people who might provide weapons or supplies, and most importantly, chose a date when they could achieve maximum surprise and coordination. August 22nd was no accident. It fell during the height of sugar harvest season, when enslaved people were already working around the clock and moving between plantations. It was also a time when many white colonists would be celebrating at social gatherings, making them vulnerable to coordinated attacks. The uprising began at 10 p.m. with prearranged signals, drums echoing across the northern plains. Fires lit on hilltops, conch shells blown in patterns that carried messages for miles. Within hours, plantations across the region were in flames. But this wasn't mindless destruction. The revolutionaries had specific strategic objectives: capture weapons and ammunition, destroy the economic infrastructure of slavery, free as many enslaved people as possible, and establish defensible positions in the mountains where they could organize a proper army. The speed and coordination shocked colonial authorities. Plantation after plantation fell to the rebels. Sugar mills were destroyed, processing equipment was smashed, and slave quarters were opened to liberate their inhabitants. Within 3 days, nearly 100,000 enslaved people had joined the rebellion. The rebels demonstrated remarkable military acumen from the beginning. They understood that they couldn't defeat professional European armies in conventional battles, so they adopted guerrilla warfare tactics that played to their strengths. They knew every path through the mountains, every cave that could hide supplies, every river crossing that could be defended. Many of the revolutionary leaders had retained military knowledge from their African homelands, where warfare often involved irregular tactics, ambushes, and intimate knowledge of terrain. They combined these traditional strategies with European military techniques they had observed or learned through service in colonial militias. The rebels also showed sophisticated understanding of the psychological aspects of warfare. They deliberately targeted the symbols of colonial power. Plantation houses were burned, overseers were killed, and the elaborate social rituals that maintained white supremacy were violently disrupted. These actions sent a clear message: the old order was finished. Colonial authorities were caught completely off guard. The governor, the Comte de Blanchelande, had fewer than 1,000 regular soldiers at his disposal, and they were scattered across the colony. Local militia units, composed mainly of white colonists, proved largely ineffective against rebels who knew the terrain intimately and had nothing left to lose. Desperate messages were sent to France, Britain, and Spain, begging for military assistance. But help was slow in coming. France was consumed by its own revolution and couldn't spare significant forces. Britain and Spain, while eventually interested in intervening, needed time to organize expeditionary forces. This delay proved crucial. It gave the rebels time to organize, to establish leadership hierarchies, to create supply lines, and most importantly, to demonstrate that they could actually defeat colonial forces in battle. The early military victories were psychologically transformative for the revolutionaries. For centuries, enslaved people had been told they were inferior, incapable of self-governance, naturally suited only for bondage. But here they were, outfighting professional soldiers, capturing weapons and equipment, controlling territory, and making strategic decisions that proved their military and political capabilities. News of the rebellion spread rapidly throughout the Caribbean and to the mainland Americas. Enslaved people in Jamaica, Cuba, Venezuela, and the southern United States heard that their brothers and sisters in Saint Domingue had risen up successfully. Colonial authorities throughout the region began implementing harsh new security measures, terrified that the rebellion would spread in the United States. Slave owners like Thomas Jefferson watched events in Saint Domingue with growing alarm. The nightmare scenario that had haunted American slave owners since the colonial period, a successful slave rebellion, was actually happening. And it was happening on a scale that dwarfed previous uprisings like those led by Nat Turner or Gabriel Prosser. But for the rebels themselves, military success was only the beginning. They faced enormous challenges. How could they maintain unity among people from dozens of different African ethnic groups who spoke different languages? How could they obtain weapons and ammunition without access to international arms markets? How could they create government institutions when most of their population had been deliberately denied education? Most daunting of all, how could they transform a successful rebellion into a sustainable revolution that would not only end slavery, but create a new society based on freedom and equality? The answers to these questions would determine whether the Haitian Revolution became a footnote in history like so many failed slave uprisings, or whether it became something unprecedented, the foundation of a free black nation that would inspire liberation movements around the world. Leadership of Toussaint L'Ouverture. From the chaos and violence of revolution emerged one of history's most extraordinary leaders, a man who would transform from enslaved coachman to military genius, from a literate laborer to sophisticated diplomat, from colonial subject to founding father of black freedom in the Americas. His name was François-Dominique Toussaint, but history would know him as Toussaint L'Ouverture, the opening, because he found openings where others saw only walls, opportunities where others saw only obstacles, victory where others saw only defeat. That Toussaint's early life revealed little hint of the greatness to come. Born around 1743 on the Breda plantation near Cap Français, he was more fortunate than most enslaved people. His master, Count de Breda, was relatively humane by colonial standards, and Toussaint was trained as a coachman rather than assigned to the brutal labor of sugar processing. This privileged position within slavery gave Toussaint advantages that proved crucial to his later leadership. He learned to read and write, illegal for enslaved people in most circumstances. He studied military history, reading accounts of great generals like Caesar and Alexander. He became fluent in French and learned some Latin. Most importantly, he developed the analytical mind and strategic thinking that would later confound European generals. But Toussaint also retained deep connections to African culture and traditions. He practiced Vodou, the syncretic religion that combined African spiritual beliefs with Catholic imagery, and which served as a crucial organizing force among the enslaved population. This dual cultural fluency, European intellectual traditions and African spiritual practices, made him uniquely capable of uniting diverse groups under his leadership. When the rebellion began in August 1791, Toussaint initially remained in the background. At nearly 50 years old, he was older than most revolutionary leaders, and his position as a privileged house servant made some rebels suspicious of his loyalty. But as the movement evolved from spontaneous uprising to organized revolution, Toussaint's extraordinary abilities became impossible to ignore. His first major contribution was transforming the rebel forces from an undisciplined mob into a real army. Most enslaved people had no military training, and their early tactics relied primarily on overwhelming numbers and intimate knowledge of terrain. This approach could win individual battles, but couldn't sustain a long-term war against professional European armies. Toussaint understood that lasting victory required disciplined troops who could fight conventional battles when necessary while maintaining the guerrilla advantages that had brought initial success. He established training camps in mountain strongholds where former field hands learned to march in formation, use captured artillery, and coordinate complex military maneuvers. More remarkably, he created a command structure that united people from dozens of different African ethnic groups who had been deliberately separated by slave traders to prevent communication and organization. Under Toussaint's leadership, Wolof speakers served alongside Yoruba veterans. Congo warriors fought beside Mandinka strategists, and gradually, a shared Haitian identity began to emerge from this diversity. Toussaint's military innovations went far beyond training and organization. He developed new tactical approaches that maximized his army's advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. When facing superior European forces in open battle, his troops would engage briefly and then disappear into mountains or forests, forcing enemies to pursue them into unfamiliar terrain where guerrilla tactics proved devastating. He also understood the crucial importance of logistics, the unglamorous but essential work of feeding, equipping, and moving armies. While European commanders often found their forces starving or lacking ammunition in hostile territory, Toussaint's troops lived off the land they knew intimately and captured supplies from defeated enemies. But perhaps Toussaint's greatest genius lay in his diplomatic skills. He realized that the Haitian Revolution was taking place within a larger context of European conflicts, and that success required not just military victory, but sophisticated international politics. The situation was extraordinarily complex. France was at war with Britain and Spain. All three European powers had interests in the Caribbean. Free people of color, white colonists, and different factions of revolutionaries had competing agendas. Into this maze of conflicting interests, Toussaint inserted himself as a masterful player who could negotiate with anyone while trusting no one completely at different times. He formed alliances with Spanish forces fighting against France, British commanders seeking to limit French power in the Caribbean, and French revolutionary officials who needed his military support. He played these European powers against each other, while steadily consolidating his own position and expanding the territory under revolutionary control. His correspondence with European leaders reveals a sophisticated political mind that understood both the language of Enlightenment idealism and the practical realities of power politics. When writing to French officials, he emphasized his loyalty to revolutionary principles of liberty and equality. When negotiating with British commanders, he stressed the commercial advantages of trading with a stable, independent Haiti. When dealing with Spanish representatives, he highlighted their shared Catholic faith and opposition to French revolutionary atheism. Most importantly, Toussaint never lost sight of his fundamental goal, the permanent abolition of slavery and the creation of a free black society. Unlike some other revolutionary leaders who might have been satisfied with personal power or limited reforms, Toussaint consistently pushed for the most radical possible outcomes. In 1794, when the French National Convention officially abolished slavery throughout the French Empire, Toussaint celebrated but remained skeptical. He had seen too many promises broken, too many legal changes reversed when political winds shifted. Only complete independence could guarantee that slavery would never return to Haiti. Throughout the 1790s, Toussaint systematically eliminated rivals and consolidated power while maintaining the facade of loyalty to France. He defeated other revolutionary leaders who challenged his authority. He outmaneuvered free people of color who wanted to maintain their privileged position above formerly enslaved people. He neutralized white colonists who hoped to restore the old plantation system. By 1801, Toussaint controlled virtually all of Saint-Domingue and had begun implementing his vision of post-slavery society. He established a constitution that declared all people equal regardless of color, guaranteed religious freedom, and prohibited the return of slavery forever. He reopened trade with Europe and North America, proving that a black-led government could participate in international commerce as an equal partner. But Toussaint's greatest achievement may have been psychological. He proved to the world that formerly enslaved people could govern themselves effectively. His administration maintained order, collected taxes, negotiated treaties, and defended territory against foreign invasion. Every successful policy decision, every military victory, Every diplomatic triumph was a refutation of centuries of racist propaganda about black incapacity for civilization. This success made Toussaint dangerous to every slave-owning society in the Americas. If a black general could defeat European armies, if formerly enslaved people could create stable government, if Haiti could prosper without slavery, then what justification remained for the entire system of racial oppression that defined colonial society from Virginia to Brazil? Napoleon Bonaparte certainly understood this threat. The rise of Toussaint L'Ouverture represented more than a local colonial rebellion. It was a challenge to the entire racial hierarchy upon which European wealth and power depended. And Napoleon, despite his other military commitments, would soon decide that this challenge had to be crushed before it inspired similar revolutions throughout the Americas. The stage was set for a final confrontation between the forces of slavery and freedom, between the old world of racial oppression and the new world of equality that Toussaint had begun to create. Role of Jean-Jacques Dessalines and final victory. The year 1802 brought the Haitian Revolution to its most critical moment. Napoleon Bonaparte, master of Europe, had decided that the success of Toussaint L'Ouverture posed too great a threat to the entire system of slavery and colonial control. If formerly enslaved Africans could govern themselves successfully, what would prevent similar uprisings throughout the Americas? Napoleon's response was characteristically ambitious and ruthless. He would send the largest expeditionary force ever assembled for colonial warfare to crush the Haitian Revolution once and for all. Under the command of his brother-in-law, General Charles Leclerc, over 40,000 French troops, veterans of European campaigns, sailed towards Saint-Domingue with secret orders to restore slavery and eliminate the revolutionary leadership. This massive invasion presented an existential crisis for the revolution. Toussaint's diplomatic maneuvering, which had served so well against divided colonial forces, proved inadequate against Napoleon's overwhelming military commitment. When French forces landed in February 1802, they brought more soldiers than had ever been deployed in the Caribbean, along with advanced artillery, cavalry units, and most ominously, plans for systematic racial extermination. The French strategy was deceptively simple: divide the revolutionary leadership through false promises, defeat them in detail, and then implement a policy of genocide disguised as colonial restoration. They initially proclaimed that they came not to restore slavery, but merely to re-establish French authority under the existing constitution that Toussaint had promulgated. Some revolutionary leaders believed these promises and laid down their arms. Toussaint himself, facing impossible odds and hoping to spare his people further suffering, eventually agreed to negotiations. In May 1802, he formally submitted to French authority in exchange for guarantees of personal safety and assurances that slavery would not be restored. That it was a fatal mistake. Within weeks, Toussaint was arrested through treachery and shipped to France, where he would die in a prison cell in the Alps, far from the Caribbean sun and the people he had led to freedom. His last words, reportedly spoken to his French captors, proved prophetic. "In overthrowing me, you have cut down in Saint-Domingue only the trunk of the tree of liberty. It will spring up again from the roots, for they are many and they are deep." Those roots would soon sprout in the person of Jean-Jacques Dessalines, a man whose path to leadership was as extraordinary as the revolution itself. Born in West Africa around 1758, Dessalines had been enslaved as a child and brought to Saint-Domingue, where he endured the full brutality of plantation life. Unlike Toussaint, who had enjoyed the relative privilege of house service, Dessalines knew intimately the savage conditions that ordinary field hands faced daily. This background shaped his character in crucial ways. Where Toussaint was diplomatic and calculating, Dessalines was direct and uncompromising. Where Toussaint sought to work within existing systems, Dessalines was prepared to destroy them entirely. Where Toussaint hoped for gradual transformation, Dessalines demanded immediate revolution. When French forces began implementing their true agenda, the systematic elimination of black leadership, and the gradual restoration of slavery, Dessalines understood immediately what Toussaint had been too trusting to see. There could be no compromise with slavery, no negotiation with racial oppression, no half measures in the struggle for freedom. The turning point came when news reached Saint-Domingue that Napoleon had restored slavery in Guadeloupe and Martinique. Despite earlier promises to maintain emancipation, General Leclerc's forces began arresting and deporting prominent black leaders, while importing new enslaved people from Africa and re-establishing plantation discipline. Dessalines made a decision that would determine the fate of the revolution. He would resume the war, but this time there would be no quarter given, no negotiations considered, no compromise accepted. It would be independence or death, freedom or extermination. The war that resumed in late 1802 was different from earlier phases of the revolution. This was no longer a struggle between various factions within colonial society. It was a race war in which the very survival of black freedom in the Americas was at stake. Both sides understood that defeat meant not just political subordination but potential genocide. Dessalines proved to be a military commander of extraordinary ability. His tactics combined the guerrilla warfare expertise that had served the revolution well with conventional military strategies learned through years of fighting European forces. He established mountain strongholds that could withstand siege, organized supply lines that kept his armies fed and equipped, and most importantly, maintained the morale and unity of forces facing overwhelming odds. But Dessalines had an unexpected ally: yellow fever. The disease that had always plagued the Caribbean proved devastating to European troops who lacked immunity built up through childhood exposure. General Leclerc himself died of fever in November 1802, and by early 1803, Napoleon's magnificent expeditionary force had been reduced to a few thousand sickly survivors, holed up in coastal fortifications. The final campaigns of 1803 demonstrated both Dessalines' military genius and his uncompromising vision of freedom. At the Battle of Verdières in November 1803, his forces defeated the last major French army in a conventional engagement that proved black troops could outfight European soldiers not just through guerrilla tactics, but in direct, disciplined combat. Even more significant was Dessalines' political leadership during this final phase. He understood that military victory was meaningless without a clear vision of what would replace colonial rule. Unlike earlier revolutionary leaders who had sometimes been content with autonomy within the French Empire, Dessalines insisted on complete independence and the total abolition of slavery that on January 1, 1804, at Gonâves. Dessalines proclaimed the independence of Haiti, the indigenous Taino name for the island, in a ceremony designed to mark the complete break with colonial rule. The declaration was read in Creole, the language of the formerly enslaved population, rather than French, the language of the colonizers. The words of the declaration were uncompromising. We have dared to be free. Let us dare to be so by ourselves and for ourselves. Let us ensure, however, that a missionary spirit does not destroy our work. Let us allow our neighbors to breathe in peace. May they live quietly under the laws that they have made for themselves. And let us not, as revolutionary firebrands, declare ourselves the lawgivers of the Caribbean, disturbing the peace of the islands that surround us. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Haitian independence was not political, but social. Dessalines' constitution declared that all citizens, regardless of color, would be considered black in legal terms, not as a racial category, but as a political identity that meant free person who rejects slavery. This was a direct repudiation of the complex racial hierarchies that had defined colonial society. The international reaction to Haitian independence was immediate and overwhelmingly hostile. The United States, despite its own recent revolution against colonial rule, refused to recognize Haiti and imposed a trade embargo that lasted for 60 years. European powers coordinated diplomatic and economic isolation designed to ensure that the Haitian example would not inspire similar revolutions elsewhere. Most shamefully, France eventually forced Haiti to pay massive reparations to compensate former slave owners for their lost property, a debt that crippled the Haitian economy for generations and demonstrated that even in independence, the costs of challenging slavery would be enormous. But none of this could diminish the world historical significance of what Dessalines and his compatriots had achieved. They had accomplished something that no other enslaved population in human history had managed: the complete overthrow of colonial rule. the permanent abolition of slavery, and the creation of an independent black nation that would serve as a beacon of hope for oppressed people everywhere. Why Haiti's revolution was unique. To truly appreciate the magnitude of the Haitian Revolution, we must place it in the broader context of slave resistance throughout the Americas. For over 3 centuries, enslaved people fought back against their oppression in countless ways, from individual acts of defiance to large-scale rebellions. Yet only in Haiti did these efforts result in permanent freedom and independent statehood. This uniqueness wasn't accidental. It resulted from a specific combination of circumstances that existed nowhere else in the slaveholding Americas, along with extraordinary leadership and an unshakable commitment to freedom that transcended all obstacles. Consider the scale of other major slave uprisings and their outcomes. In 1739, the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina involved about 100 enslaved people who fought bravely for their freedom before being crushed by colonial militia. In 1811, Charles Dessalines led over 400 enslaved people in an uprising along the Mississippi River that was similarly defeated by overwhelming force. Even larger rebellions met the same fate. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion in Virginia involved detailed planning and initial success, but ultimately fewer than 100 people participated, and the uprising was suppressed within days. Gabriel Prosser's conspiracy in 1800 Virginia might have involved over 1,000 people, but it was betrayed before it could begin. In Brazil, Quilombo communities like Palmares created independent settlements that lasted for decades and housed thousands of formerly enslaved people. But even Palmares, at its height, never controlled territory comparable to an entire colony, never defeated European armies in conventional warfare, and was eventually destroyed by Portuguese forces. Jamaica's Maroon communities achieved something closer to Haitian success. They forced the British colonial government to sign treaties, recognizing their freedom and autonomy. But these agreements were limited to specific mountainous regions and never challenged the fundamental institution of slavery throughout the island. What made Haiti different? Several factors combined to create revolutionary possibilities that existed nowhere else. First was the demographic reality. Nowhere else in the Americas did enslaved people constitute such an overwhelming majority of the population. In Haiti, they outnumbered free people by a ratio of more than 10 to 1. In the United States, enslaved people never exceeded 40% of the population in any state and were vastly outnumbered when the entire nation was considered. This numerical advantage was crucial for sustaining a long-term revolutionary war. Second was the geographic advantage of Saint-Domingue's mountainous terrain, which provided natural strongholds that were nearly impossible for European armies to penetrate. The Blue Mountains of Jamaica offered similar advantages to Maroon communities, but Jamaica lacked Haiti's size and the diversity of terrain that allowed revolutionary forces to maintain multiple bases of operation. Third was the international political context. The Haitian Revolution occurred during a period when European powers were distracted by their own conflicts: the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars, and various imperial competitions. This created opportunities for revolutionary diplomacy and prevented any single European nation from committing unlimited resources to crushing the rebellion. But perhaps most importantly, Haiti developed a quality of leadership that was unmatched in other slave rebellions. Leaders like Toussaint L'Ouverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines combined military genius with political sophistication in ways that allowed them to transform a slave uprising into a successful war of independence. Other rebellions were often led by remarkable individuals: Nat Turner's religious vision, Gabriel Prosser's organizational skills, Denmark VC's international perspective, but they lacked the combination of military, political, and diplomatic abilities that Haitian leaders demonstrated over more than a decade of continuous struggle. The Haitian revolutionaries also benefited from cultural advantages rooted in their African heritage. Many had retained military knowledge from their homelands, where warfare often involved guerrilla tactics similar to those that proved so effective against European armies. The religious traditions of Vodou provided organizational networks and spiritual motivation that sustained resistance even through the darkest periods. Most crucially, The Haitian Revolution succeeded because its leaders refused to accept anything less than complete freedom. Many other slave rebellions were suppressed when leaders accepted negotiations, pardons, or limited concessions. The Haitians learned from Toussaint's tragic mistake in trusting French promises. Under dessalines, they would accept nothing short of independence and the permanent abolition of slavery. This uncompromising vision was both the source of Haitian success and the reason why their revolution terrified slave owners throughout the Americas. If compromise had been possible, the rebellion might have been contained like so many others. But because the Haitian revolutionaries insisted on complete transformation of society, they created something genuinely new in human history, a nation founded on the principle that all people, regardless of race, possessed an inalienable right to freedom. Legacy and global impact. The shockwaves from the Haitian Revolution rippled across the globe, challenging fundamental assumptions about race, slavery, and human capacity that had justified centuries of oppression. No institution, no government, no intellectual tradition remained unchanged by the reality of what formerly enslaved Africans had accomplished in the Caribbean. The immediate impact was felt most powerfully throughout the Americas, where millions of enslaved people received the electrifying news that their brothers and sisters in Haiti had won their freedom through armed struggle. This knowledge spread through the complex communication networks that connected enslaved communities across vast distances, through sailors and traders, through traveling craftsmen, through the oral traditions that preserved and transmitted crucial information despite efforts to suppress it in the United States. Slave owners lived in constant terror that the Haitian example would inspire similar uprisings. President Thomas Jefferson, despite his eloquent writings about liberty and human rights, refused to recognize Haitian independence and imposed a trade embargo that would last for 60 years. The contradiction was stark and revealing. The nation, founded on the principle that all men are created equal, could not tolerate the existence of a black republic that took those words seriously. Southern plantation owners implemented harsh new restrictions on enslaved people's movement, assembly, and access to information. They understood instinctively that knowledge of Haitian success was dangerous. It proved that freedom was possible, that black people could govern themselves, that the racial hierarchy that justified slavery was a lie, but the news could not be contained. Denmark VC's 1822 conspiracy in Charleston was directly inspired by Haitian success, and participants spoke openly about Haiti as proof that organized resistance could succeed. Nat Turner's 1831 rebellion, while not explicitly connected to Haiti, occurred in a context where enslaved people knew that revolutionary freedom was possible. The impact extended far beyond North America. In South America, leaders like Simón Bolívar found crucial support from Haiti during their wars of independence against Spanish rule. President Alexander Pétion provided weapons, supplies, and safe harbor to Bolívar's forces in exchange for promises to abolish slavery in the territories they liberated. This assistance proved crucial to the success of South American independence movements that in Brazil, Quilombo communities gained new legitimacy from the Haitian example. If black people could successfully govern an entire nation, then surely they could maintain independent communities within Brazil. The psychological impact was transformative. Resistance changed from desperate rebellion to legitimate struggle for rights that had been successfully claimed. Elsewhere, European colonial powers throughout the Caribbean and Africa watched Haiti with growing alarm. The success of the revolution forced them to reconsider their policies, strengthen their military presence, and develop new strategies for controlling populations they had previously dominated through simple, overwhelming force. Intellectually, the Haitian Revolution posed challenges that European thinkers struggled to address. For centuries, philosophers and scientists had constructed elaborate theories proving that Africans were naturally suited for slavery, incapable of self-governance, and intellectually inferior to Europeans. The existence of Haiti demolished these theories, but also created a crisis for enlightenment thinking. How could Europeans continue to speak of universal human rights while denying recognition to a nation that had successfully claimed those rights? How could they maintain theories of racial hierarchy when Haitian leaders had demonstrated political and military abilities that exceeded those of most European leaders? The response was often willful blindness. Many European and American intellectuals simply ignored Haiti or dismissed its success as an aberration. Others developed new theories that acknowledged Black capacity for certain kinds of achievement while maintaining overall frameworks of racial superiority. But some intellectuals drew more radical conclusions. Abolitionists throughout Europe and the Americas pointed to Haiti as proof that slavery was not only morally wrong, but practically unnecessary. If Haiti could prosper without enslaved labor, then what justification remained for the institution anywhere? The economic impact of Haitian independence also reverberated globally. Before the revolution, Saint-Domingue had been the most profitable colony in the world, providing enormous wealth to European merchants and manufacturers. The destruction of this economic engine forced European powers to seek alternative sources of tropical products and to reconsider the economics of slavery, the British abolition of the slave trade in 1807, and the gradual emancipation of enslaved people throughout the British Empire were influenced partly by the recognition that the Haitian model posed fundamental challenges to the entire system of plantation slavery. Perhaps most importantly, Haiti became a symbol and inspiration for liberation movements that would emerge throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Frederick Douglass, the great American abolitionist, visited Haiti and praised it as proof of Black capabilities. Marcus Garvey's Pan-African movement drew inspiration from Haitian success. Leaders of African independence movements in the 20th century studied the Haitian Revolution as a model for anti-colonial struggle. The legacy continues today. Every movement for racial justice, every struggle against oppression, every assertion of human dignity draws strength from the knowledge that in Haiti, people who had been considered property proved they were fully human by creating a nation based on freedom and equality. Conclusion. As we reach the end of this extraordinary story, we must pause to contemplate what the Haitian Revolution truly represents in the grand sweep of human history. This was not merely a successful slave rebellion, though it was certainly that. It was not simply an anti-colonial war, though it achieved that goal as well. The Haitian Revolution was something far more profound. It was the moment when the universal principles of human equality and freedom were tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable and proved to be not just beautiful ideals, but achievable realities. Think about what the revolutionaries faced. The three most powerful military forces of their era arrayed against them simultaneously. An economic system that generated enormous profits for the most influential people in the world. Racist ideologies supported by centuries of pseudoscientific theory and religious justification. International isolation that cut them off from potential allies and trading partners. Against these overwhelming odds, people who had been systematically brutalized, deliberately kept illiterate, legally classified as property, and told daily that they were subhuman, somehow found the courage to declare themselves free and the strength to make that declaration stick. They did this not through luck or accident, but through extraordinary leadership, brilliant military strategy, sophisticated diplomacy, unshakable unity, and an absolute refusal to accept anything less than complete freedom. In doing so, they demonstrated capabilities that their oppressors had insisted they could never possess. The Haitian Revolution proved that human dignity is not a privilege to be granted by those in power. It is an inherent right that can be claimed by anyone willing to fight for it. It showed that systems of oppression, no matter how entrenched, no matter how profitable, no matter how widely accepted, can be overthrown when people decide they will no longer tolerate injustice. Most importantly, Haiti demonstrated that freedom is not a zero-sum game. When the Haitian revolutionaries declared independence, they didn't seek to enslave their former masters or to create a new hierarchy of oppression. They simply insisted on their right to be treated as human beings, to govern themselves, to make their own decisions about their lives and their futures. This vision, radical in 1804, still revolutionary today, continues to inspire people around the world who face oppression, discrimination, and injustice. The tree of liberty that Toussaint L'Ouverture spoke of in his final days has indeed grown from deep roots. spreading its branches across continents and centuries. Every time someone stands up to tyranny, every time an oppressed people claim their rights, every time human beings choose freedom over security, dignity over submission, hope over despair, they honor the legacy of the Haitian Revolution. The revolutionaries of Haiti changed the world by proving that another world is possible. That may be their greatest gift to all of us. The knowledge that no condition is permanent, no injustice is inevitable, and no dream of freedom is impossible to achieve. Haiti showed us what human beings are capable of when they refuse to accept limitations others try to impose on them. In a world that still struggles with inequality, oppression, and the denial of human dignity, that lesson remains as relevant today as it was over 2 centuries ago. The Haitian Revolution, proof that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, but only when courageous people grab hold and pull it in the right direction.